Hey, I'm Darren Steele, and this is Think Queerly, a thought leadership podcast to empower queer creators and change makers to discover, create, and evolve to make a difference for the betterment of all humanity. Now, today I'm having a three-way. No, I'm kidding. But I have two guests with me today, Ken Popert and Jeffry Iovannone. I'd like to first introduce Ken. First of all, Ken, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show today.
Well, I'm always happy to have an opportunity to exercise the fragments of my memory, Darren.
Well, a little bit of a biography as provided by you. You live in Toronto, where I live, and you were born in 1947. You began your lifelong career in gay activism as a graduate student at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, USA in 1968. You returned to Toronto in 1973 and became a leading member of the Body Politic collective, writing and editing for the widely influential Gay Liberation Journal. And you met your current long-term partner, Brian Mossop, at the city's 1974 Gay Pride March. Upon its demise in 1986, the Body Politic collective entrusted the future of its nonprofit enterprise to you, which you led as president and executive director until your retirement in 2017. And the connection here is that you were my boss for about 6 or 7 years directly when I worked for Pink Triangle Press between 1993 and 2004. And Jeffry, thank you. You've been on the show a couple times. Good to have you back.
Excited to be here and for our conversation today.
Wonderful. So a brief bio for those that don't know Jeff. He's a queer historian and historic preservation planner from Buffalo, New York. And he's the co-founder of Gay Places, an initiative that documents LGBTQ historic sites in Western New York with Preservation Buffalo, Niagara. He's currently working on a master's degree in historic preservation planning at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And that's actually why the three of us are here. Mm-hmm. So, Jeffry, I'd like to hand over to you now. Could you give us an explanation as to the research you're doing and why you came to me and said, could we have a discussion with Ken Popert?
Yeah. This all came about because last semester I took a course at Cornell called Making Public Queer History. It's taught by Dr. Stephen Veeder, who is the director of the Public History Initiative at Cornell. And as part of the course, we did a whole unit on Cornell's queer history, and we were reading and looking at materials from the Human Sexuality Archive at Cornell, which is the second largest LGBTQ archive, sexuality archive in the country. And as we were looking at some of those materials, we're reading things from Cornell student newspapers, newsletters, the name Ken Popert stood out to me. And I was like, why is that familiar to me? And so Darren, I texted you and said, this might be a weird question, but was it you that told me about Ken Popert? And you said, yeah, he was my boss at Pink Triangle Press. So I thought this would be an interesting conversation because of the intergenerational connections between us. Ken and I, as Cornell students, Darren, you worked with Cornell or Ken at Pink Triangle. And then you have been an excellent mentor to me. So it's just really fascinating, I think, kind of finding out these unexpected connections, and that, I can also be doing that sort of research and taking a class like that at Cornell, in part because some of the work that Ken did when he was a student, and that's impacting what students at Cornell are doing 50 plus years later.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think what draw your attention to the name is that a little over a year ago, Jeffry and I did an interview with the authors of Out North, which looks at the archives, pulling together pictures and slides and what's being held in the archives and looking at sort of it through a historical lens of various periods. And of course, there's a lot of information there from extra PTP and the Body Politic, because that was something that came out of the Body Politic. And I think we might be touching a little bit of information on that further on in some of our questions. But to get Ken involved here on the discussion, maybe I can lobby the first question here. Ken, could you tell us about your background, how you ended up at Cornell and then became involved in gay student activism at that time?
Right. Well, I should say it's a bit of I didn't grow up exactly in Toronto. I was born and grew up in Scarborough, which, is sort of Toronto. It is now. So I was a suburban kid. And I first began to think of myself as being different in some fashion quite early on. And in fact, I had a sexual relationship with my boyfriend for about 2 years while I was in high school. So, but I wasn't out to anybody, and I never actually thought of myself as being gay, really, until one day he sat up in bed. We were taking advantage of a parental absence, and he said, "You're a homosexual." And I thought, didn't we both just? But anyway. So, I mean, there's a lot packed into that. You start to think about it. There's the self-denial, there's the reproach, the categorization and so forth. But anyway, so you needed to know that for some background. So then I went on to the U of T. I was interested in languages and linguistics, but they did not have at that time a linguistics department. However, I was fortunate enough that in my fourth year, one of my professors nominated me for a Woodrow Wilson fellowship. And that in turn meant that I had to apply to 3 universities. And at the time, I had no plans actually become an academic. I just was not thinking about that at all. But this door suddenly opened up for me. So I applied to 3, U of T, of course, University of Alberta, and Cornell. And of course, Cornell threw huge amounts of money at me. Unlike the other 2 universities. And as crass as it seems, I ended up at Cornell because they had such a lavish scholarship program. So that's what brought me to Cornell in 1968, fall of 1968. Now, again, if I can be allowed to run on a bit here, I started thinking about what I was and who I was just around the time I was leaving the U of T, and because I'd gone away on a hiking trip through northwestern South America with 3 friends, I had plenty of time to think about what I felt about them and so on. So to make a long story short, I went to a psychologist when I got to Cornell to their student services there, and told him I thought I was gay, but I didn't know what to think about or what to do or anything. And it was actually, God bless the man, he said, well, you know what? I have drug addicts waiting to see me. I have people who are completely gone. So you just go to this gay organization. This is not a psychological problem. And he sent me to what was then called the Student Homophile League, which of course, it was not a hugely inviting name. It sounded kind of dull and also kind of slightly sinister. Somehow. But, I went to one of their meetings, and that's how I came out to my first group of people and got involved in the organization and in activism.
Amazing. And just a note, the difference between funding of Canadian and American universities is there's just really no comparison. I remember when I was considering doing my PhD before I left my master's, 2 of my professors, one of my advisors said, "We will not give you letters of recommendation to apply at a Canadian university." And I was studying at Carleton University in Ottawa, but it was because for what I was going to be doing, German language and linguistics, is you have to go to the States and you need to either go to one of these 2 or 3 universities, and you won't have to pay a dime. Whereas in Canada, I might be suffering, having to live in squalor just to get to the university.
All right. I know it's a terrible way. It's a terrible thing to say, but I saved enough money from my scholarships and fellowships to actually form part of the down payment for our first house. So,
Wow.
but it's not the same now, even in the United States, though. It's a lot tougher for young people now.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So, Ken, what program were you in at Cornell?
I was majoring in linguistics, which was centered on moral hall, if I remember correctly. But I had a minor in anthropology.
Okay. And what can you, from your perspective, what was Cornell like at the time, and what do you think it was like for gay students?
Oh, well, it was not particularly encouraging environment neither was Ithaca for that matter, obviously, for gay people. There was really only one place to socialize, which was the inevitable gay bar. I think it was at the top of State Street, if I remember correctly, Maury's.
Okay.
But it was also sort of the bar for other excluded groups as well. For a while, I think it was the black bar as well as the gay bar. So that was the principal way that people went to socialize in Ithaca and at Cornell. And it's one of the things I think we were hoping to remedy a bit when we later on opened the Gay People's Center, because we wanted to give some place for people to meet where they didn't have to buy drinks or whatever to justify their presence, right? But that was about it, other than house parties, which of course were very common. But that was the extent of the social life. Of course, a lot of people in Ithaca, they went away. One of the odd things about Ithaca is equidistant between New York, Montreal, and Toronto. And people would often go away for a weekend. Believe it or not, they would drive 5 hours to have a weekend in usually New York, but also sometimes those other two cities, right? So people used to describe it as centrally isolated. That was the phrase I remember from people talking about how they felt living in Ithaca when they'd come from elsewhere. So.
I was just sort of interested in, house parties today would be something entirely different in the sense, but that probably would have had much more of an underground feel, I would imagine.
Oh, yes, of course.
How was that communicated? And was there a different type of people at the house parties that may have either come to the bars or have come to the student center?
Well, the disadvantage of house parties, especially in a small location like Ithaca, is you knew that you were going to know everyone already before you even got there, right? So as venues for sexual initiative, they were not very promising unless you were a new person. So there's that aspect of them. But as I say, they did at least allow you weren't on somebody else's property, really, the way you felt when you were in Maury's, where you were there because he allowed you to be there, right? And you weren't allowed to forget that, I think, in all sorts of ways, nor did you allow yourself to forget it. So that in itself would be a big difference, just to be on territory that was not being shaped by someone who was not part of your community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Go ahead. So I want to talk a little bit more about Maury's, but before we get there, if we could backtrack a little bit. So you said you went to see a psychologist at Cornell who essentially sent you to the Gay Student Organization.
Okay.
Can you tell us more about that? Like when you went to your first meeting and what that was like, and how you started getting more involved with the group, and how it changed over your time there.
Well, unfortunately, I have to tell you, I don't remember my first meeting with the organization. In fact, most of that is a foggy blank, and I feel badly for not being able to remember it. But I've been squeezing my brain for the last week and rereading the stuff that you sent, hoping it would shake something loose. But honestly, I don't remember anything about that, except I'm sure that's where, I encountered a couple of important people, but whom I remember. But I don't really remember much about the meetings of the organization. Now, I did become, as I recall, the editor of the newsletter for a while. And that's how I got involved in journalism, really, gay journalism. But but I don't remember anything about the organization's functioning, really.
Who were the important people that you met, that you just mentioned?
Well, let's see. First of all, there were three. There was eventually, not immediately, Stephanie Stephanopoulos, Janice Kelly, and Jane Gallup was really a wonderful woman. And Bob Roth, of course, who was the big mover and shaker of the organization, and his boyfriend, Morris Essam. Those are the people that I immediately remember. And of course, I know that Gerald Moldenhauer must have been floating around there somewhere, but I think he had left Cornell in Ithaca just before I arrived. But I'm sure he was probably mentioned by people.
And he was the founder of the original student group, the Student Homophile organization.
Well, I can't really testify to that. And as you know, Gerald seems to have been a prolific founder, but I don't have any information there. That would have happened before I arrived in any case.
Do you remember the switch in the name of the organization from the homophile organization to making the decision to go by the name Cornell Gay Liberation Front?
No, I don't, but it would certainly have been influenced by the emerging anti-war movement and the anti-racism movement. I mean, obviously the word front is borrowed from other movements that had already emerged at that time. So.
Mm-hmm. What kind of other political activism were you involved, or was it just gay liberation specific?
Well, initially I was just involved in the gay organization, but of course there was this whole bubbling political milieu around it, arising out of the women's movement and the anti-racism movement and the anti-war movement. All of that was happening at more or less the same time. Nevertheless, as I recall, the gay issues were not really on the radar of the anti-war people, particularly until very much later in my time there. Partly because I guess that was true in general in American society at that time, because the whole gay thing was just emerging at the end of the 60s, whereas the war had been going on since the middle of the 60s and was finally starting to come home to people. So I was on the edges of things. I never got involved in any of the other organizations, though, partly out of caution because I was a foreigner, but partly because none of the people that I knew really were invited. I didn't know anybody, for example, who was a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, which became the big focus for political protest on the campus. So. I did join in some of the later the occupations of buildings and so forth, but of course the thousands of people did, and the university had ceased functioning at that point. So,
Jeff, I know there's a few sort of reference points that you want to get into, but I also want to ask Ken about. I don't know if this is a particular. Sex Information for Cornell Students is a booklet that was printed in 1972. And in some ways it's, well, first of all, it's a big difference in the language that is used in it, that it's a little bit more, call it prolific, a little bit more stronger from the activist and a bit more in your face, necessarily so. On page 62 of this particular document, the title is Homosexuality. And this is actually written by you and Jane Gallup, members of the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front. What strikes me that I just don't know if you'd see this in literature anywhere today so boldly is one of the paragraphs. First, you should realize that there is nothing wrong with being gay, all caps. Right. Keep telling yourself that until it sinks in. Right. I just that reminds me of Queer Nation when I was part of that a little bit in Ottawa in the early 90s, I think. But I wonder if you could maybe speak to some of that languaging and maybe that sort of power in the languaging that you then brought into Body Politic later on.
Right. Well, you have to realize, who we were speaking to there. They're largely people who had grown up in isolation with some knowledge of themselves, maybe a lot, maybe not very much. At that point, they knew that they were homosexual or lesbian or gay or homophile or whatever. But we needed people to come together on that basis to affect change. We needed to build a constituency, right? And you weren't going to build a constituency out of people who did not feel very good about themselves and weren't even sure that they were right to think that they deserved better, right? So that's why, the early movement, many of the slogans have a quasi-therapeutic sound to them, like gay is good and we are everywhere. It's all reassurance, right? And that was an important thing at that time, because you can't have politics of any kind without a constituency. You need bodies, you need an army. And so we needed to get those recruits from somewhere, right? So that's probably partly why the language is that way. It's tended to be startling. It made people think, what? But yeah, you have to let a firecracker off to attract attention. There is something I would like to add about that as this come back to me. I remember attending a great anti-war rally in Washington towards the end of my time at Cornell. And the keynote speaker was a guy named I.F. Stone, who was a famous anti-war journalist who had pieced together an indictment of the American effort in Vietnam out of newspaper clippings, little bits of information he'd been able to spot and ferret out, because most of it was a secret, of course. But he stood in front of this great mass of probably 500,000 people to whom he was a great hero. And he said, well, this may be therapeutic, but is it politics? And that has really stuck with me through all of these years, to ask that about everything. Is this mainly about making yourself feel good, or is it about making some sort of change happen? Now, of course, they can be the same thing, right? But it's easy to fall into thinking you're doing something important just to, start making people feel better about themselves. Mind you, you need to do that to get them to do anything else. But anyway, so I thought that was a very wise and incisive observation.
That's interesting. I think I see that. I was mentioning I'm reading Tim McCaskill's book, Queer Progress.
Yeah.
Although he doesn't say what you just said, that, I guess, attitude or approach often shows up in some of the letters to the Body Politic when there were divisive situations. And, sometimes the Body Politic was on defense mode. Sometimes they were on offense mode. But whatever the case was, there was sometimes this trying to draw the line in the stand between, are you just trying to feel good, or is this actually, in a sense, activism? Yeah. Like, are you speaking to activism, or are you actually trying to make a change? And I wonder if some of the tension in activism in general is sometimes fighting so hard for the cause that you almost forget the humanity in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think sometimes being an activist is like being a surgeon. You can't be squeamish, right? Or you're not serving your patient well. A member of the collective, Walter Blumenthal, said to me once, because we were arguing over whether we should publish a particular case of injustice involving a prisoner. He said, well, gay liberation is about the lawn. We can't look after every blade of grass. Again, it can sound harsh, but it is completely true. And again, it's another thing that someone said that's always, stuck with me. And of course, you have to mix your social engineering side of you and your human social side as well. But I think the trick there is not to let them get in each other's way, right?
Yeah, interesting. Mm. Jeffrey, do you want to cycle back to some?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking in terms of Darren's question about the language that you used in this manual, mm-hmm. and the importance of building a constituency of gay people. As gay students at Cornell, how are you finding each other? Right? How are people finding out about meetings or house parties or other places to socialize? Like how was that information being disseminated?
Right. Well, this may be a little before your time, but people used to be very dependent on telephone trees and
Yeah.
networks to communicate community information. And that's how, particularly like house parties and so on, would get around, because there'd be no place where you could post that information and count on any significant number of important people to you reading it. And I'm quite sure we wouldn't have been allowed to put up posters in Maury's, which would have been the obvious place to do that. So it was mainly because it was, first of all, it was a small group of people. That's an important point to remember. And there were many close relationships and friendships, and of course animosities in that group. So I don't think we would have used mainly telephones to pass information around, or actual in-person communication. Right? That's different from leafleting strangers, of course. Since there was no internet, and weren't even any portable phones. You sat at a desk and you called people. Right?
So basically, like, if you wanted to go to a Cornell GLF meeting to find out about that, you had to know someone else who was in the group or connected to the group that would tell you about that?
Well, you saying that does remind me. I seem to recall there was a bulletin board at Millard Straight Hall. It was mainly preoccupied with people finding rides out of. It's so typical of Ithaca. Mainly, its main function was to help people get out for the weekend, right? But I'm sure organizations put up posters about their meetings there, and I'm quite sure we would have done that for sure. Yes. We may have. Obviously, we would have wanted to get stories into the student newspaper, the Cornell Sun, and so forth too. But it was always before we had our current technology, it was always a big challenge. It was always much more labor intensive to bring people together for any purpose.
And do you ever remember? Were there any instances of people tearing your flyers down, or anything of that sort, or did people basically, let them be?
I don't remember any specific instances, but I'm pretty sure that would have happened, particularly initially. But I can't say that it was a big issue that I recall.
And aside from the student meetings that were happening on campus, we've mentioned a couple times the bar called Maury's, which was in College Town, so it's a section of Ithaca. There's a high, student population, businesses that are catering to students. Do you tell us a little bit more about what you remember about that? My understanding is that this bar did not open as a gay bar, but students wanted somewhere to socialize, so people just started kind of going there and essentially trying to turn it into a gay space.
Right. Well, just as a preface to that, I mentioned something we haven't touched on that was important. Yeah. There were two different populations in the gay community, right? There were the students, but there were also the people who were called townies, and I don't know whether they still use that dismissive term. The local people who had grown up in Ithaca, who were also part of that group. And of course, there was Ithaca College, although I don't recall it was ever an important source for us. I think that's a degree mill for the wealthy. So as for Maury's itself, I don't have much memory of it, except it was very dark inside. And I have an image in my brain of it as having a fairly big windows on the front, but you couldn't really see in very well because of the lighting. I don't recall it ever being inside the place myself, although I'm sure I must have. Am I correct in thinking that the bar was on the right when you went in, the service area, or do you know that, Jeffrey?
I don't know. What I do know is that, so the address of the bar was 409 Eddy Street.
Okay.
And that building is still there, but I'm not sure, I haven't been in the building. I'm not sure what the layout was when it was functioning as Maury's.
Right, yeah. But it's unfortunate, but I don't really have much, although I know it was important to the community. I do not have much recollection of being there that often, and I may not have been. I was probably in my early puritanical phase where I thought that we should try to replace those institutions rather than engage them, right? We did have that idea, some of us, that where our job was to erase everything and start over again. Right?
I mean,
so when you say that, oh, Darren, go ahead.
Sorry, do you mean like erase the bars and start over?
Yeah. Well, ignore them into existence. We wanted to create a new world, right? And we weren't so good at seeing you had to get the lumber from somewhere. That took a while.
This idealism without an actual foundation to support the plan, so to speak.
Well, I mean, it's a continuing thread throughout most, at least in my experience, gay activism and probably activism in general, even right down to the early days of the Body Politic and right up to the Bath Raids. We always felt we were separate from the people we were talking to. And we were aware of it, and we didn't like that so much, but we didn't know how to fix it. Partly because we came from our class backgrounds were different quite often from the people that we were attempting to engage and so forth. So that way, as you may, it was often a discussion in the collective, like how can we stop seeming so academic and la-di-da, right? Well, for some of us anyway, others were quite happy to have it that way. And I think that's, that remains right down to the present day a problem with progressive politics, this tendency to look upon your constituents as people different from yourself, right? And in really bad cases, it leads to this sort of the saved and the damned kind of psychology that's very inward looking. But I'm straying very far from the point here. But I think that's why I may not know much about Maury's, remember much about Maury's. I may have decided to not to go there that often, but to stick to our own center and so forth.
Well, I'm sorry, I would just interject before you head off to your next point there, Jeffrey. Sorry, is connected to this, I think, is kind of what form of counterculture were you participating in that time, from dropping acid to, whatever it was at that time that would have put you into that sort of mindset of let's, recreate the world from scratch.
Right. Well, I'm just trying to figure out what I can say here that might not land me in a concentration camp in about 20 years. Before I arrived at Cornell, I was, my final year or so at the U of T, I was part of a fairly large group of LSD users. And we used to gather in designated rooms on the weekend and do what was called dropping acid. And we would actually spend most of the 2 days in that particular location. So there was that. And I was never much into marijuana for some reason. I liked the psychotropic drugs. They were very interesting. So so coming then to Cornell, I did not continue that. I do remember when I must have been smoking at that time, because I do remember my parents came and picked me up and drove me home one year for at the end of the semester. And I foolishly, I don't know what I thought, brought along a bag of seeds to, I guess I was thinking of planting them when I got home so there'd be something there to use. But anyway, just as we were coming to the border check, I went to check on, make sure the bag was secure, and I spilled the seeds all over the bottom of the car, the back seat. So the last 100 yards, as we gradually moved up to our meeting with the Canada Customs person, I was frantically trying to scoop these seeds back into the bag, also without attracting my parents' notice, who were sitting right in the two front seats, right? So I finally just decided to brazen it out and got away with it. So, but I must have been using marijuana, I guess, at Cornell for some period of time. But that was all I can think of, though. And I think part of it was the supply of LSD degenerated quite a bit in the the early 70s. You couldn't be sure what it was that was on that bit of blotter anymore.
I was going to say one of the the things I sent you was a interview that you had done with the Cornell Daily Sun,
Yes.
which is a student newspaper.
Right.
And you talked about this difference between the gay community focusing their energy on educating the public versus helping each other.
Right.
And that seems to connect to what you're saying about Maury's and maybe why you didn't spend that much time
Right.
there. That like, here's a space where it's kind of our space, but we're not really welcome.
Right.
So maybe we should concentrate on instead, right, our own spaces versus a space that's only partially our own.
I think the key issue there is control, right? Who establishes what you can do, what you can't do, what you can say, what you can't say. And of course, that's entirely out of your hands on private premises. And often, of course, with gay bars everywhere, the rules could change without you even noticing it until you contravene them, right? So yes, that would be an important point. I will come back to the issue, though, because it's always been a big one for me, is you can't lead without followers. So,
yeah. And so, Ken, you said you did participate in the demonstration that happened with the students against Maury's Bar, or you weren't part of that?
I have a memory of being in this crowd of maybe like 100 people or something like that, and I do have a recollection of Maury coming out to speak. I think he's sort of was he not a bald, or do you know what he looked like? Because I have a recollection of a guy who was sort of slightly bald and maybe with glasses, but that's all the only thing that comes to mind when in connection with his name.
I don't know. I don't think I haven't seen a picture of him come up.
So that's about. I do recall that, although it may be just auto suggestion, right? But not any. I don't recall anything about organizing the demonstration or the actual character of the confrontation.
Yeah, and my understanding is, essentially he opened this bar and then was welcoming to gay students at first, and then becomes hostile towards that, and that there were members of the Cornell GLF who had been ejected from the bar by Maury for being too gay,
Right.
and then the students. So this would have been October 15th of 1970. Then the students and I think along with residents of Ithaca as well kind of organized this demonstration against the bar to kind of get him to change his policy. And one of the other things I found is in the Cornell GLF newsletter, members of the organization actually writing to the state liquor authority and saying hey, right, this were you involved in that at all, trying to contact the state liquor authority and say hey, this is what this guy is doing?
I don't recall that I was, and I probably wouldn't have, because I wasn't a citizen and a voter. One thing you might want to follow up, I have a sort of a filament of a memory there that one of his difficulties was that he was a member of the local Democratic Party apparatus.
Yes. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. I came across, I think in some of the GLF newsletters, that the issues started when he was thinking of running for political office, right? So I'm happy to take the gay students' money if they want to drink at my bar and hang out here. But then, if that's going to hurt me politically, then that's not okay anymore.
Yeah.
And another thing that he was doing is technically, according to the state liquor authority regulations at the time, he couldn't just kick someone out for being gay, but bar owners could kick people out for being intoxicated.
Right.
And and that he was essentially just kicking the gay students out and saying, oh, you seem intoxicated, you need to get out of here. So kind of exploiting that that loophole in the regulations to kick gay people out of his space.
Right. I know he probably used it on many occasions, not just for gay people. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so it's unfortunate that that's not much of a big subject in my
That's
brain.
okay. Well, Ken, one of the other things that you were involved in is helping to establish a Gay People Center in Ithaca. And can you tell us a bit more about that? So the student organization, right? You were originally meeting on the campus at Willard Straight Hall,
Right.
which is the student union. Why establish your own Gay People Center? Why just not keep meeting on the campus?
Oh, well, I think there would be two important considerations there. A lot of people we would have assumed or would have known did not want to be seen coming and going from our office in Willard Straight. And of course, it was a high density area, traffic and so forth. The second thing, of course, is the issue of the non-students and perhaps not feeling on home territory in the student union building. But as I recall, and when this was solved by the getting off of the campus, but also I believe the office we had off campus, it was in a building, right? And so the fact that you went in the doors of that building didn't say anything about where you were going in the building, right? So I think that was probably a consideration as well. Mm-hmm. I do recall that the university was a university-owned building, was it not? Because they were the ones who provided the space for us, very grudgingly, I might add, as I recall. We even had there was no furniture at all in the place. We built our own furniture, believe it or not. One of the members built these suspiciously low-slung sofas with no backs, which immediately drew suspicions from some janitorial staff, I believe. So it was just all it was just an unused empty space. We had to create the whole thing ourselves.
So that there was no sign that said Gay People Center. You had to kind of be in the know.
Did we have a sign on the door? I can't believe we didn't because of our politics. I'm sure probably maybe not on the outside of the building though. But I don't know I can't remember how signage was for the building, right? Whether there was a display of everyone who was in there or not.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that that building where the first Gay People Center was located, it moves to a different location later, but I don't think that building is there anymore. I think they knocked it down and it's a bank now.
Right. Well, very Toronto experience. Well, that's too bad because it would be nice to have a plaque there now to tell people these things. And,
yeah.
You could still have one on the sidewalk, somewhere. But anyway.
So, what were some of the things that you were doing at the center? What were some of the services or activities that the Gay People Center was offering?
Well, of course, we had social events that allowed us to organize them the way we wanted to. And I believe we were allowed to serve liquor even in those premises.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but it being New York State, I think that would have been allowed. But importantly for me, that was where we put together the newsletter.
Okay.
So, and of course, our meetings were held there. And it doesn't, by the way, so the meetings, actual core of the organization was never more than about, I would say, 12 or 15 people. But I guess that's probably true of organizations, except in times of high political unrest and activism. So I remember sitting on those low benches, in fact, or sitting around the outside of the room to conduct the meetings. And I remember one meeting in particular, I made myself very unpopular because I became impatient with the inability of people to come to order. So talking endlessly, and I finally raised my voice in order to get the meeting going, and it was apparently quite shocking to everyone. I just had reactions, but I do remember that. So I said, "Oh no, I won't do that again."
What was the composition between Cornell students, quote unquote townies from Ithaca, men and women?
Right. Well, I can only go by the people that I can remember knowing. And as far as students versus the town population, I think I would put that at about 2 to 1. There's two Cornellians for every Ithacan. Men to women to men, I'd say maybe a quarter of the students, our members were women. They were all, but interesting, they were some of the more memorable members. I can recall right when we began talking, the names of the 3 people I remember immediately are all of the women members of the organization, because they all went on to do distinctive things, I believe. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't an uncomfortable mix at all. I don't think it ever came up as an issue, but maybe that's because the people from the town didn't feel comfortable raising it. I don't know.
Any students of color, or was it mostly white students at that time?
Oh no, I think it was almost entirely white. And that would have been true. I mean, I don't know how much you know about Cornell in the 1960s and 70s, but it had a very small group of Black students, and a lot of the unrest on the campus grew out of the friction between them and the administration, leading, of course, to the armed occupation of the student unions. So, that's another one of my. It's funny, almost none of my memories of Cornell have to do with its educational function. They all had to do with things that happened quite beside the fact. I remember walking by Bullard Street Hall the morning after it had been occupied and seeing the guns sticking out of the windows, and that has always stuck with me, that image.
And so that would have been spring of 1969.
I guess I don't remember exactly when that was, but certainly early on, yes.
So did the Cornell GLF, in terms of the Black student organization occupying Willard Straight, were you seeing that as, at all in connection to some of the work that the GLF was doing, and your political struggles as gay students, or did you see it as something separate?
Oh, well, I'm sure some of us would have thought, gosh, we could do that. No, I mean, you can tell by the language of the gay movement in its beginning how it borrowed extensively from the Black movement, the women's movement, right? And so international movements for national liberation. So that's why it was a rupture from the earlier homophile movement in the United States in particular, which was used a different language entirely in different terms and had a different understanding of what it was for, right? The Mattachine Society was held in considerably and perhaps now unjustified contempt by the GLF. But that was true everywhere. When I came back to Toronto, there was already a split between the Gay Activists Alliance and the Gay Activists Toward Equality. That's what Gay Acts Toward Equality, and the Community Homophile Association, right?
Yeah.
So that was a pretty common everywhere. So yes, we certainly were inspired by these movements, and I have no doubt that we were just as individuals at the university as well swept up, because you have to understand that many of the members of the student members in particular of the organization would also have been open to being arbitrarily drafted and sent away to Vietnam. And that was the really big thing, that horrible thing they did everywhere. They had a lottery and pulled birthday numbers out of a drum. And if your birthday came up, that was it. You were.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the kind of psychology that would have created. So I'm sure members of ICE, I became involved, as I said, on the fringes of the larger movement. And I thought it was very educational. I did learn things from that I found useful later on, particularly the way masses of people change their minds almost suddenly and apparently magically. There's a lot to think about in all the things that I saw happening. Right. I remember because when I first arrived there, Students for Democratic Society was a small very small fraction. The student body was 13,000 people, I believe, and the SDS had about 200 members.
Okay.
And they were isolated from the student body very much as activists that I consorted with later in Toronto were isolated from the Toronto gay community. But this strange thing happened that because of various crises, including the occupation of Willard Straight, the president of the university, I think his name was Perkins, called a convocation of the students. And so people dutifully trooped off the convocation. I was not among them. And he spoke to them. But I could tell afterwards, as they came away from the place where they'd heard him speaking, that there was this vast dissatisfaction and disappointment in the air. And in fact, he had just lectured them on the values of a liberal education, totally irrelevant to the situation. And that night, I went home and I was sitting in my room listening to the campus radio, and they started reporting that SDS had seized the military building there. Is it called Olin? No, that's the library. I forgot the name, but and occupied it. And then they started reporting that people had started to join them. And so I'm listening to this and all through the night. And by morning, there were thousands of people had basically gone from supporting the administration to supporting Students for Democratic Society. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, how does this happen? And I'm a very lucky guy because I've seen this twice right in front of my eyes. Because the second time was the Toronto bathhouse raids, where completely passive, politically uninvolved population overnight turned into this raging army of activists, right? So it's also why it's connected to why I'm in journalism, or why I was in journalism. How do I make that happen was the thing that was always on my mind.
Yeah. Were you at all involved with the gay counseling line that the Gay People Center?
No, I don't believe so. That's not my thing.
Okay. Because I asked this because I am just wondering.
I'm the wrong person. If there's just someone looking for sympathy for their problems, right?
I was just wondering, in terms of students that were actually out and involved in the organization versus students who might have been there that would have been closeted, but might have been calling for help or connection in that way, right? That kind of discrepancy about who is actually there versus who is actually visible,
right? Yeah, well, I don't recall. I'm pretty sure I would not have been involved because above all for personality reasons, right? Probably no one would have let me on the line to talk to anyone in their right mind, anyway.
Do we want to start drawing parallels into Canada? And
yeah, that's a good idea.
Sure.
Right.
So thinking, Ken, all that you saw, witnessed, and especially just what you were talking about here, seeing how an entire crowd of people, an entire mindset of a mass of people can literally change overnight. How did your experiences then at Cornell influence your work, your thought process, the founding of the Body Politic, and everything that sort of followed after that? Maybe start with the Body Politic, however you wish to present this.
Well, I would like to clarify there. It was already shouting away by the time I returned to Toronto. It had been founded about 18 months prior to my return to the city. And I can remember my first reading of that because it was so humiliating. I'd been sent away to write a review of a book, Carla J. and somebody else's anthology, American book. And I was so naive at that time, and still so much the academic. I went through, my review was like thousands of words long and tried to address every single element in the anthology. And of course, I read this out loud, and I could see Ed Jackson there, sitting there trying not to scream at me as I trudged my way through this article, because we used to read them out loud at the collective meetings. So I remember that for sure. At the time, it had not become the highly defined project that it later became. There were a lot of different agendas at work. In fact, I talked about this subject, I think, to the UST students a couple of years ago, the different groups of people within the collective. And for me, because I'd gotten involved in the newsletter when I'd been in Cornell, that's probably the reason I gravitated to the Body Politic because for various reasons, that's how I wanted to affect the world, is through journalism and advocacy, speaking to unseen audiences. That's a great thing about publishing, right? It takes you out of your personal circle to a host of strangers. And so I got some experience with that, with the newsletter at Cornell. And then when I came back to Toronto, everything was just bubbling, you know. The city I had left didn't have a particle of gay activism in it. And I returned 4 years later, and it was everywhere. Right? So there was a vast change that occurred that I felt I had missed the bus, first of all, because I was away in another country when all of this happened. But it did give me the advantage of not having any baggage at that point. And so naturally I was drawn to the Body Politic because I'd already become interested in the whole question of how do you move people to political action through writing. And it, of course, had dubbed itself a gay liberation journal. And it was a group of people who were very much like myself, university educated, largely male, at that city at that time, largely entirely white. So it seemed like a natural place for me to start.
What year was that exactly?
Gosh, I remember because it's always in my mind. It was my flight from Ithaca, like Joseph and Mary's flight from Egypt. It was February of 1973, following my breakup with my boyfriend Joe Savego. Okay. Also, he was an important person in the life of the organization. Went on to be a well-known writer, but died unfortunately too young. Yeah. Mm-hmm. As did, it's funny, most of the people that I knew, the men that I knew at Cornell, I have a great fear that most of them have passed away. But I've been able to track down a few of them, so I know that's the case for some.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming back to Toronto. So yeah, that's mainly what I brought back with me. There was my journalistic experience, but also because I was involved on the edges of the anti-war movement and participated in these vast demonstrations. That was an important formative experience for me too, because I had not had the experience of being in a large, organized, angry crowd with a mission. And so I saw how this came to be, how you caused demonstrations to happen, how you controlled them, what the outcomes were like, and so forth. So I learned about that. I learned about organizing, and also about propagandizing, I think. And of course, as I've mentioned, I also had a chance to observe what actually happens to people when their worldview no longer makes sense to them. That suddenly they're available to think something new.
Yeah. There's something you said there about organizing, and I wonder if that's more in the writing or both on the ground. Just thinking back to the number of times there was the bathhouse raids and then the sudden protests that happened, but then again, the police raiding again, and then another protest. And there was quite a few years where people were coming together very quickly and usually being on Yonge Street.
Right.
And then to McCaskill's book, there's one example where the crowd of queers just got too upset and we're basically starting to chase after the queer bashers that were hanging out.
Oh, I was one of them.
Yeah, but the meeting afterwards,
it's actually just up the street from here, where that happened.
But what I found so interesting is I don't know if it was Tim or somebody else that at a follow-up meeting they said, because the marshals lost control and the marshals got involved in fighting back, and they said something along the lines of, no matter what your politics are, you are there to sort of control the event so that we can at least come out to the other side without being the bad group.
Right.
And it was as tough as that is, there's something to be said for that kind of management and leadership of the people that are going to somehow bring leadership to a group of people to stand up for their rights, but not to lose it so much that there could be some sort of a devastating or very negative result.
Right. Well, of course, again, that's Tim's highly disciplined approach to politics coming out, which I share. But there's some times when there's nothing you can do. And that was one of those times. It's funny you're talking about that, because I was one of those marshals. And I remember forming up our line across Church Street facing the police officers with our arms linked. And they moved forward towards us, sort of banging their shields and waving their batons, and attacked us. And we started to fall back, and the line dissolved. There was nothing we could do, because at the same time we were attacked from behind. And not to make a big deal of it, but I was a marshal. Suddenly my arms were no longer linked. I turned around, see what was happening. It was hit by a police car, right? So I appreciate Tim's purity there, but he emerged from that with a cracked skull. So I'm sure he would admit that, you do not always have 100% control of the situation. So, and sometimes the crowd knows better than you do. So, but, sorry, was that germane to anything? I've forgotten whether I wandered off down an alleyway there or something. So.
No, I was just sort of interested in, I'm really glad you brought that up, that you were one of the marshals. And I do remember in the telling of that story that you were hit by a police car, that he had been injured as well. And, there are situations we're seeing across the globe where, this aspect of peaceful protest only goes so far when the people who are holding the power are not giving way. And, it's just, to me, I know there's police brutality, but looking back, it's appalling the way, Toronto police, Canadian police handle themselves, and the problems we still have today. It's endemic. But the way it was framed, it just seems to me that there's an aspect of how much was going on within so many different types of politics and political movements in the 70s and the 80s. And in some way, I don't know if this sounds elitist, but I think we've lost some of the intelligence of our advocacy and our reasons for doing things today. It doesn't seem like people really understand how much there is to lose right now.
Right. Well, certainly there's been a big change, but that's true in progressive politics generally. There's been a loss of understanding of what it is we need to articulate, what we want, what we're trying to achieve. It's been the sort of whole-scale retreat into the self, disguised as a movement, right? But people can only remain blind to material realities for so long. Again, to come back to my point, when the Body Politic Collective was isolated for most of the first, 7 or 8 years of its life from the people it wanted to speak to, they looked down at us, they laughed at us, they thought we were crazy. In retrospect, though, I realized we were doing something important. We're laying out this worldview and this set of ideas about what could be. And yes, they may have dismissed it all as utopianism, but they didn't forget it. They stored it away on some top shelf in the backs of their brains somewhere. And then suddenly, when the bathhouse raids came and they dashed their conviction that there was sort of an unspoken understanding between gay people and lesbians and the city and the police, they were looking for something that helped make it all what they were seeing make sense again. And that's when they reached for that shelf, and saw, they were right. This is what all of this means, right? So you never know when that is going to happen. People are not, of course, obviously, they're not simple machines, right? Very complicated machines, and they can look like everything is politically dead on the surface, when in fact things are boiling away underneath. So yes, we're in a bit of a doldrum right now with activism, I think. But that's because I think the people currently involved will not be the people who lead whatever happens when it happens. There'll be a new layer of leadership that will be brought forth by events. I mean, yes, you're right. We don't have the same kind of people now that we had then. But I think the truth is those people are still around, but there's no opportunity for them to act in the same fashion. There's no constituency for it right now. So I think, those potential leaders and activists are always there, but there have to be people who need a leader and know that they need a leader.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how does the archive that the Body Politic created factor into all of this and the other work that you were doing? Like, how did you see it fitting in with? So there's the publishing piece,
Right.
and then also the political activism piece. Like, why did you decide to create? I think at first it was the Gay Liberation Movement archives, then Canadian Gay and Lesbian Archives.
Right. Oh, I attribute that all to Jim Stakely, one of the American members of the collective, because he was the one who uncovered the hidden history of the gay movement in Germany.
Okay.
And it was first published in the Body Politic. And looking at that, I thought, we've done all of this before. Why didn't somebody tell us? We could have skipped a step. And that made me realize how important it was for us to know our own history and what we've done before. And again, I've made this point to the student groups I've spoken to. You have to know your history so that you know what you're capable of. Because we forget that. I sometimes I sit with young people, or I did when I was the head of Pink Triangle Press, and they would look at the pictures of demonstrations, and clearly they didn't see themselves in those pictures. And I would go and get the photographs and say to them, look at these people. They're you. They're the same age as you are now then. It wasn't some group of super people, superhumans who did this. There's ordinary people. So the history, it would have been very valuable. It was valuable to us to see that everything that we wanted to do had in fact been done before. So that's why I thought it was important to keep a record of everything that was happening to us. And fortunately for history, we happen to be in a city with this almost perfect arc of political history, right? That begged to be preserved as an epic poem or something like that. So that's why I thought it was important to, and I think most members of the collective felt it was important to preserve not just our own. It was important to preserve not just our own history, but whatever other history we could find that was relevant. Had this huge mass showing people what is possible. That's what history shows us. It shows us what is possible, I think. Now, the archives here, I wish, my original idea was that it should be more outward facing than it evolved, because it's been largely the work, of course, of archivists and academics and so forth, and does a good job for researchers and so forth. But I often wish that they spend more of their time on showing the collection to people, because to me, that's when it finally achieves its purpose. There's no point in saving it, collecting it, and preserving it if it's just going to remain in a vault somewhere. It needs to be brought out and shown to people. They're doing that now, or at least they were before the pandemic with their building. But there's so much more scope there, I think, to bring those materials before people.
Yeah. And the process of creating this archive, right, is in and of itself historic and controversial, because some of the materials that you were collecting were seized.
Right. Yes, exactly. Well, unfortunately, they had to make some compromises there. They I do recall at one point they had to, for a practical reason, divest themselves of a lot of their porn collection, for example, because the laws around that changed, and also there was a lot more scrutiny suddenly than there had been in the past. So it's unfortunate that some things have not been saved, but I always look at it in terms of what has been saved, not in terms of what has not been saved. So, and archives, although they seem sometimes like otherworldly activities, have to live in the real world and face the same pressures the rest of us do.
So there's a question about the difference in the presentation of history as a sort of starting point in the States. For the longest time, it was after Stonewall. But in Canada, the name of the organization became Pink Triangle Press, starting with the pink triangle that was used for gay people that went into the concentration camps in World War II. What are some of your thoughts on that differentiation in the presentation and preservation of history and telling the story in Canada versus the United States?
Well, partly that was just our resistance to the overwhelming American presence, of course. But it's also, again, there was always this problem for me that Stonewall always seemed like a beginning when in fact it was a continuation, and people needed to know it was a continuation. It was a rebirth. And they needed to know that because I knew it would eventually run out of steam and they would need to think that it was possible to be reborn again, right? So that's why, to me, it was important to have that lesson that Stonewall was not a new thing and resistance was not a new thing. Also, of course, it was very important to me, again, for people to realize this was a North Atlantic European phenomenon. It wasn't just our little candle here, right? That put us in the context of a great expanse geographically and chronologically. It was a fabric that we could easily attach ourselves to and make ourselves understand our own importance better.
So, Darren, should we go to you and talk about how you ended up at Pink Triangle and how Ken impacted you as a boss and as a mentor?
Sure. Yeah, I had been at Carleton University and had completed my first year, Carleton University in Ottawa, completed my first year of my master's. And I think it was towards the end of my fourth year as an undergraduate student, I was applying for a scholarship to study in Germany through the German academic service. It was something like a year and a half out that you had to do the application. And again, Ken, like no cell phones, everything was done by fax. It took days to get an answer back on anything. It was so much labor. And even though I was training in Middle High German linguistics, how esoteric could that possibly be? And with the side of feminism and Latin, sometimes I just shake my head at myself, right? I was really coming into my political advocacy gayness at that time, and I was part of the gay organization at Carleton University, and I wanted to do some sort of a gay topic. And I look back at that now, and I realize I was actually proposing a queer theory thesis for my master's thesis before queer theory even existed, and I had a hard time trying to find someone in Germany who I could then use. Anyway, I got to Europe, got to Germany for the year, found out that my idea was just impossible. Came back very defeated after basically changing my master's thesis and then agreeing to a research essay, which meant I would have to take one more course. And, long story short, in my sort of defeatedness, I remember reading in Gaze of Ottawa, the newspaper in Ottawa, that Extra was going to launch a newspaper in Ottawa. And I think it was just previously you had launched Extra West.
That's right.
So I think I phoned Toronto and I asked, how do I find out about this? And they're like, you'll have to talk to Brandon Matheson, who was going to be the publisher. And I contacted him and I started volunteering in that office, basically helping out with whatever was happening there, delivering the first batch of newspapers, renting a van, driving out to the airport, picking up the whole sled of Capital Extra magazines for distribution. Eventually started working there and then moved to Toronto, to the Toronto office. And then there were some big structural changes internally. And I went from working for somebody else to suddenly working for Ken. Or not working for Ken per se, but The electronic media division was dissolved, and then I was appointed as audio text director for the cruise line telephone dating personal system that was primarily for gay men and was the revenue generator for Pink Triangle Press at that time. So I'm waiting for who's going to jump in and the next question here.
Well, what about how did working with Ken, impact you, and then what you're doing now?
Oh, interesting. Okay, it's funny. I had Ken and I met for a coffee maybe about a month ago when we were just talking about this upcoming podcast and reminiscing a little bit. And I would have to say, I was very green as someone in a position of management, having staff, and very inexperienced in the sense of learning how to communicate or work in a team meeting when the other directors, like the publisher of Extra or some of the other divisions or whatnot. And I do recall putting my foot in mouth quite a number of times. But I think there was an aspect of PTP being very much a grassroots feel as an organization. And I don't know, Ken, if it was your background and other people's background in sort of this, counterculture, very politically active, that even though you were very straightforward and didactic and very open with me, there was no shit. There was one time I really screwed up. I got a good formal letter from you, but there was an aspect of you just being able to, I think, look at the passion that I brought to the organization and not overlook my failings or mistakes, but try and help me to improve myself because I was so committed to the mission of PTP, which at that time, I think the short version was Daring Together to Set Love Free. And my role was to try and bring in as much, net profit as possible to fund all of the different things that PTP wanted to be able to do.
Well, the thing I remember, Darren is right about that. I always used to emphasize to people that we wanted to hire not what I called or what people called the best person for the job. I always wanted to hire the best person for the organization. And what I meant by that is I wanted someone who understood and supported the goals of the organization, understood its history, and could also grow in the organization. And that's why, Darren was a bit dismissive of his background in a whole High German, but it's exactly the kind of people that I loved hiring, people with varied backgrounds who'd gone from one thing to another, rounded people, who would bring a not just narrow technical understanding to what we were asking them to do.
Right. Well, I think, Jeff, you had also asked, how does that influence some of the work that I'm doing now? It's so interesting that as technology changed towards the last couple of years when I was working at Pink Triangle Press, was the internet was already there and it was starting to evolve, and we were starting to see, I believe gay.com might have been one of the first or at least most well-known internet dating sites. And then there were a few more coming out, and we were seeing the demise of the telephony dating services, for which that was my role. And I was starting to question, well, what do I want to do next? Because I'm either going to have to evolve in the organization and I don't know what we're going to be able to do, or I'm going to move on. And for a time, I decided to go into fitness and wellness and personal training. But now I feel like I've, in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, really come back into all that I took from my university, all that I took from that idea that was sort of a queer theory thesis, and then my experience for almost 11 years at Pink Triangle Press, this awareness, this large body of history, these relationships I've had with different people, and the growth that I experienced by being exposed to these different personalities. Many of whom are simply not with us anymore, because at that time when I was with PTP, it wasn't until when did the antivirals come out? It was like early 2000s. So, we still lost a number of people that had been working with us. So,
well, I would like to say, talk about just a little bit about how Darren influenced me, since we're on this subject. First of all, I was very admiring of when he left us that he decided to set out on his own and build his business, because it's something I don't think I would ever be able to do, because I'm finally an organization person. So that really impressed me. Second thing is I learned what being neat really meant from Darren. I had thought I was a neat person until I saw his office. So I've always aspired to be as neat as Darren ever since. So, and that's had consequences for some people, but there you are. So thank you for that, Darren.
Now I'm glad that Darren hasn't seen my messy office.
Crazy.
Well, I know I'm looking at the background behind Darren there. I can see like this is absolutely like the creation of somebody who believes a thing for everything and everything in its place, right? Even the checkered cover on the, I guess it's a bed or a sofa there.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, it's very curated.
It is very curated. Yes, my furniture is black. It's black and white over here.
And the
walls are actually filled with art on this side of the wall. You can't quite see it, but it's like everything is very neat. And while I was adjusting the camera before you all came on, the picture back there I had to align because I could see it wasn't parallel to the other two small pictures.
Well, I also should mention the books have all been stacked pyramidically, so that
yes.
It's funny. I've spent some time since we've been online at meetings for 2 years now. I spend a lot of time looking at people's surroundings to see what I can divine about them.
Just listening to both of you, it strikes me that in terms of Pink Triangle, I don't think there's quite an American equivalent for what you were doing in terms of how it was this collection of publishing, and then you created the archives, and then there was the personals division, and then also making documentary films as well. And, how all of those different pieces of media and representation work together. And Darren, I think, in terms of what you're doing now with the content that you create, whether you're writing or you're podcasting, focusing on historical topics, right, in relation to queer history, how there's still kind of the pieces of all of those different things in the work that you're doing, and I also think it's really interesting to think about, right, then in terms of the experience that you had at Pink Triangle, and then in terms of like a mentor, how you've encouraged me in terms of the work that I'm doing as a historian, and then right now just happen to have the Cornell connection, and then Ken came into that equation. So it's fascinating to me to think about how all of this connects, and that like people influence us in ways that we might not realize.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how sometimes it does seem like a small world, and then sometimes you feel completely disconnected from everything. But it was 4-ish years ago when I launched my publication Think Queerly on Medium, which then became the name for this podcast. But that's where you first started writing, and who would know that along the line, then suddenly you would then be doing what you're doing now at Cornell, and then there would be this connection of minds, so to speak. But what's important to me, and it's been said here already, and Ken, you've said it, and Jeffrey, you've said it, is doing these, having the documentation in the form of archives is one thing, but also having these conversations, these memories, getting more of the on the ground personal history and the in the moment reflections as to what does it all mean now, and how can, I think it was sort of the question I was asking you earlier, Ken, is where we're at now. with everything that you've experienced around advocacy through your writing and on the ground work and standing up against like what was very much a fascist organization, the Toronto Police in the 70s and in the early 80s. What's maybe one of the most important lessons from all of that that you think is perhaps missing today? Or a bit of insight, or if not that's missing, how might you advise someone who is really keen on making a difference but is just missing that one thing?
Well, what I note, I touched on this earlier, what I note about progressive politics today is it's obsessed with image making, and it's obsessed with language, the exclusion almost of the real world. It's locked inside of this bubble. And I think it can be very comfortable to spend all of your time agree with you about everything, but it's not politics. Politics is about engaging the outside world in a constructive fashion in the hope of growing your bubble, not building a wall around it. So that's my concern is people have to come back to how do we speak to the conservative people? How do we, in the United States, how do we speak to a large segment of the population, obviously so alienated they would vote for someone like Donald Trump? I mean, they're human beings, right? They have reasons for why they do what they do. And it's far too easy to ascribe it to some sort of failing or birth defect or evil, instead of saying, well, that's what we're dealing with. So this is where we start our work.
Well, what I don't know if you're thinking about or mentioning is like this whole aspect of cancel culture, where also people are taking the meanings of words to be violent.
Right.
And I mean, this drives me absolutely crazy because you can't actually then have a meaningful discussion if someone says, well, that word triggers me and you're being violent against me. And we shouldn't necessarily go down that road here. But I think that's a limit. That's a huge limitation in being able to have this two-sided dialogue, to be able to feel contention, but to still have a conversation about it.
Right. And when it isn't about me, I might add.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, they would come back to, I mean, I think that's because the left has been infected by the consumerist culture of capitalism, and people are highly discouraged from thinking of themselves as other than individual isolated units in a collection of individually isolated units. The notion of society and of communities has been severely damaged in the last 30 or 40 years. The other thing, of course, is the flight from the material world. Again, a Canadian example, it always drives me crazy, this business about land acknowledgements as just as they are. I don't know whether you're familiar with these, Jeffrey, or not. Okay. But I sort of asked myself, if I were a member of a First Nation, which would I rather have, a land acknowledgement or clean drinking water?
Yeah.
But the thing is, the land acknowledgement doesn't cost anyone anything, right? It's cheap and it's theatrical and it leaves everything unchanged.
Right.
And I think it goes back to the point that you made earlier about, right, is this politics or is it
therapy? Is it therapy,
just about
politics?
something that's making us feel good?
Or in this case, is it marketing or is it politics, right? So,
yeah.
Right.
But I feel confident that something will finally shake people out of this world of isolated individuals. It's interesting. Someone that I was emailing this the other day asked me whether I wasn't feeling very discouraged by everything that was happening with the pandemic and the emergence of crypto-fascist movements everywhere. But I thought, one thing we don't really pay attention to, and that's largely missed, I believe the pandemic has occasioned the first time in the history of the human race when the majority of the global human population is engaged in a single project together. Very, haltingly, and a lot of mistakes have been made, and it's been used for all sorts of nefarious purposes. Still, it's an impressive thing to me to contrast this pandemic to what would have happened or what did happen, 100 years ago or 500 years ago, where people didn't even know the rest of humanity existed. So there's this real, I think there's a real incipient change of consciousness there that will have an effect on things in the longer term. So that's why I don't feel totally discouraged about that.
I almost think that's probably the best place to stop, because we ended on I wouldn't quite say a high note, but on a forward-looking with, hope note.
And before the next variant arrives.
Yeah.
The Omni Delta or something. Yeah.
Well, the next letter is pi.
Is there anything else, Jeffrey, or do you feel we've covered all bases?
I think that's a great place to end.
Wonderful. Well, Jeffry Iovannone, Ken Popert, thank you so much, the both of you, for being here. I really appreciate your thoughtful comments and the time you spent with me here today.
Also, I would like to just express a small amount of gratitude to Jeffrey for his project, because he's studying an area of history that often gets neglected, the story outside of the great metropolitan centers, and in fact, where the majority of people still live. And there's a lot of valuable stuff lying there waiting to be gleaned and learned from. So I'm happy that you're doing this.
Yeah. And thank you, Ken, for doing the work that you did. So then, blazing a path for others like myself to follow. And I always think it's just so much fun when I get to read about someone in a historical context, and then I actually get to talk to you. That's always the best thing to me.
Well, you're welcome to the future then.
Thanks again.